Good morning, myself Aman Jha, and this is the YouTube channel of The Study. We are continuing with the NCERT concept series, and today we are going to cover the last chapter, chapter 10 of class 7th history NCERT. So let's start. See, if you recall, then we have covered up to chapter 9, and today we are going to cover the 10th chapter of this NCERT, which is the last one. Up until now, we saw some political developments and some social and cultural developments. Okay, the name of the chapter is 18th century political formations. So it begins with an introduction. Basically, it sets a framework where it says that how long from which period we are going to study. It says the framework that says that from the death of Aurangzeb in 1707 to 1761 till the third battle of Panipat, some very rapid political changes took place in India, breakup of the Mughal Empire and the formation of some regional states. So that says that we are going to cover this period. Then it briefly covers the crisis of Mughal Empire and the mishandling of those crises by later Mughals, and then it talks about emergence of primarily three kinds of states. One that were erstwhile Mughal provinces, but they became practically independent. They became de facto independent, not de jure. Okay, they were de facto independent. Watan Jagirs of Rajputs, they also separated themselves from Mughal Empire, and then these kingdoms, the Sikh kingdom, the Maratha kingdom and the Jat kingdom, they fought their independence from Mughal Empire. Okay. So these are three categories of states that we are going to study. It says that the scope of this chapter is from 1707 till 1761. Some rapid developments took place in this period. What happened in 1707? Death of Aurangzeb, and immediately after, very rapid decline of Mughal Empire began. Okay, and it was brutally exposed in 1738 with the invasion of Nadir Shah. It became abundantly clear that Mughal Empire is beyond salvation now. Okay. In this period, there were two sorts of power that were expanding their footprint. A, the Marathas, and you see they have drawn lines that how they were expanding out of their Maratha Swaraj area into different parts of the country. Okay. Those Sikhs also played a role, but by that time East India Company had become the most formidable power. And the second group was expanding out of Bengal was the East India Company. Okay. If you recall, after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, they had started, they had registered themselves as a political entity now, not only a simple commercial entity, but a political entity as well. Now, the significance of this date is that this was the third Battle of Panipat. Okay. And in this battle, though recently a movie was, a very ahistorical movie was made on the theme of this war, this battle did not decide who will rule India. Rather, it decided who will not rule India. Okay. So, this is the reason why we are going to cover this period. Causes for crisis in the Mughal Empire. Okay. It says that after the death of Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire crumbled. It happened in 1707. Okay. He died in Deccan. Aurangzeb spent last 25 years of his rule in Deccan, fighting one war after the other. Okay. None of them were conclusive enough. And eventually he despaired of all his efforts and died in Ahmednagar. Okay. the Mughal Empire crumbled immediately after. Though, since that was the pre-information technology age, so the signs were there, but it became abundantly clear in the next few decades when events like, in 1720s, we will see, cover that later. In 1720s, regional states were formed, and then in 1738-39, when there was the invasion of Nadir Shah, then it became clear that this empire has declined and it is beyond redemption. Okay. Also, another point is, okay, before that, let's discuss this. What happened when the modern study of the decline of Mughal Empire began? There were certain questions regarding who is to blame for the decline. Okay, just as people try to study the decline of Mauryan Empire, just as people try to study the decline of Harappan Empire, so it was such an important empire that studying its decline was a natural curiosity. So earlier, people focused on individual responsibilities of later Mughal rulers and nobles. Very irrational and rather racial theories were also given, that how nobles of that period were born in India, so they lacked the martial quality and such stuff. Very racial characterization of the caliber of personalities of this period. They would nitpick the faults of a Badshah here or a noble there. They will nitpick the mistakes made in one policy here or one policy there. But then they realized that since the decline started immediately after the reign of Aurangzeb, mistakes must be with Aurangzeb. Now the policy, the focus shifted. The historians like Jadunath Sarkar, etc., they started focusing on, specifically on Aurangzeb. And here they talked about his religious policies, his, bigoted religious policies, his Rajput policy, his Deccan policy. For example, in the case of Rajputs, he intervened in the, succession struggle of Marwar, and that triggered, a dissatisfaction among various Rajput families. But if you recall in the chapter on Mughal Empire, we had discussed that its importance has been overemphasized. He reimposed jizya, which was certainly unpopular, but again its impact is debated because jizya was immediately repealed after his death. Very soon, not immediately, but in 5-6 years. Similarly, his Deccan policy, he failed to reconcile Marathas, just as Akbar had reconciled Rajputs and made them an ally. Aurangzeb forgot, or rather failed to do so. Okay. And at last, issues like his own quirks, like he intentionally weakened his princes. Just see, there are some historians who make this point that it was a tradition in the house of Mughals that the son challenges his father, and this had been continuing since the time of Akbar. So Aurangzeb, who had himself imprisoned his father while he was alive, learned this lesson, and he consciously or unconsciously every now and then cut his princes to the size. Okay, he will punish them for petty trivial matters. He will be very harsh on their when they would rebel on some ground. So he had this habit of cutting down his important sons to size, that he would not allow them to become very powerful, lest they challenge his authority. But the problem is, unless your successors quarrel with each other, unless one competent successor emerges, the stability of empire will be threatened. Also, his tendency to despite the fact that he wasn't much into amusement and stuff, still he was very aloof. It was very difficult to access him. It was very difficult to present free and frank opinion to him. In modern bureaucracy, we say that the role of bureaucracy is to give free, frank and fair advice to the ministers so that they can take decisions. Okay, but that was not possible in the case of Aurangzeb. He was very difficult to access to. His over dependence on ulema. He tried to combine the spirituality and politics. So there were some faults in his own personalities as well. So first, historians tried to blame the individual later Mughal Badshahs and nobles, but that did not stick. Then the focus shifted on the policies of Aurangzeb. But even here, many of the policies had, the fallout of many of his policies were overemphasized. Okay. For example, we talked about the Rajput policy. We said that how its impact has been overemphasized and stuff. So the focus once again shifted to the institutional crisis, that is beyond the responsibility of an individual. Until now, they were blaming individuals, either later Mughal Badshahs or the nobles of their time, the corruption of nobles, that how they were ambitious and trying to carve out they were looking for opportunities to carve out their independent kingdom. Then they talked about the policies of Aurangzeb, but till now, they were focused on individuals. Now the focus has shifted to institutional problems, especially the problems at the central level or from the perspective of center. And then three main issues came up: the Jagirdari crisis, though it should be, let's call it agrarian crisis. Jagirdari crisis and Mansabdari crisis are same. Okay, agrarian crisis, this is the first one. Historians like Irfan Habib emphasize this problem. Okay, then you had Mansabdari crisis, which was a combination of social, administrative and military crises. And then issues like, any lack of, remarkable increase in productivity, no new technological breakthrough and stuff like that. I mean, think about it. The three most important empire of medieval period, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire and Ottoman Empire, they started declining at the same time. Why? Because the focus wasn't on sciences. The focus wasn't on rationality. What was happening in the West at the time? They were doing age of discovery, they were having scientific revolution, they were having enlightenment. But on the other hand, the society was very much religious minded in this part of in the old world. Okay, I mean, there is this historian, traveler, Francois Bernier. He was a French who came to India, and he highlighted that there are no academies of sciences in India. Whereas Europe, UK, France, they were setting up academy of sciences. So there were new innovations in those parts of the world that were building up helping them to increase their productivity, helping them to make their armies more powerful, helping them to rationalize their administration, whereas no such changes were happening in the case of this part of the world. So these problems also existed. And then before going further, let's briefly talk about what was the Mansabdari and agrarian crisis. See, in the case of agrarian crisis, I will say a simple thing. What it meant, that frequent peasant revolts, okay, frequent peasant revolts often led by the local zamindars, and that were due to variety of reasons. A, the diffusion of military technology, so that they could now withstand the might of Mughal Empire, especially in matters of guns and stuff. B, the exploitative nature of Mughal administration. The historians like Irfan Habib point out that in some areas of the country, the taxation was as high as 3/4. Okay. Also, there are some sources, especially the European travelers, they highlight that since Mansabdar had no, incentive to invest in productivity, because he knew that my Jagir will be taken away from me in next any time. And since the Jagirs were so scarce, they knew that I don't know when I will get the next Jagir. So their entire focus was on, extracting as much revenue as possible. So there was no rise in productivity. Eventually, the local zamindars, and especially when they had a caste relationship with the peasantry of the area, then they will rebel against the Mughal administration in that case. And though peasant rebellions were common since the reign of Akbar, but up to the second part of 17th century, they became very frequent, to the extent that they destabilized the Mughal Empire. On the other hand, we had also talked about the Mansabdari crisis. I would recommend you to go back to the lecture on Mughal Empire. There we had talked about that how the problem of overassessment of any of land revenue meant that the gap between assessed income and the income that was actually realized was noticeable from the very beginning. Then the problem gradually became so intense that the Shah Jahan had to clarify that, okay, they started categorizing the Jagir on a monthly basis. That what it meant that Jagirs were categorized on a monthly basis. See, the first problem was the gap between Jamadami and Hasildami, meaning the excess income of a Jagir and the income that was actually realized, the land revenue that they could actually extract. Gradually, this problem became really big. So, emperors like Shah Jahan, what he did, he divided or conducted a monthly gradation of a Jagir. Say if a Jagir yielded, only, there were various categories. For example, suppose the assessment is that in 12 months you should get only you should get 100 rupees out of this Jagir. Let's say for calculation, in 12 months you should be able to collect 100 rupees. That will be Jamadami. But actually, or let's simplify, say that in 12 months you should get, they are saying in 12 months you should get 120 rupees out of this Jagir. But actually they were getting only 90 rupees in 12 months. So this meant that this Jagir is not yielding what is assessed, but the reality is the Hasildami is 90, but the Jamadami is 120. So it is, then in this case, say it says that you will be able to collect 120 rupees, but you are collecting only 60 rupees. So out of 12 months, only income worth 9 months was getting, collected. Out of income of 12 months, assessed income only 6 months was realized. So they categorized the Jagirs accordingly, and there were many categories. There will be 9, 12, 10 monthly Jagirs, there will be 9 monthly Jagirs, there will be 6 monthly Jagirs. So that was an acceptance that the problem of gap between Jamadami and Hasildami exists. Then accordingly, if you are being given a 6 monthly Jagir, meaning that out of the 12 months you are only able to realize the revenue worth 6 months. So your military responsibility will be less. But if you are being given a 9 monthly Jagir, then your military responsibility will be slightly more. Then there was this problem of Ek Anar Sau Bimar, if you recall what we talked about, that the gap between number of Mansabdars that were being inducted since the time of Akbar. And what happens is that if a Mansabdar was inducted, then obviously his children will also want to be enrolled in the Mansabdari system. So what is happening, that the number of Mansabdars or the members of the Mansabdari system are increasing exponentially for that reason, because now the older aristocracy also wants its children to become part of it, and you are inducting new people as well, because as the empire is expanding, you have to incorporate people from those areas as well. So the number of the claimants vis-a-vis the number of actual Jagirs that you have, or the worthy Jagirs, what we call the, if you recall the difference between Sere Hasil and Jore Talab. So the good quality Jagirs were much less compared to the number of claimants. The idea of Ek Anar Sau Bimar, that means 100 people who are desiring, whereas you have only one pomegranate. So this is the gap, that the gap between the number of Mansabdars and the Jagir, attractive Jagirs, was day by day increasing. So eventually even Aurangzeb shut down the enrollment of further Jagirdars. Okay, he said no more Jagirdars will be enrolled because we don't have enough quality Jagirs. So there was this one problem, the gap between the number of Mansabdars that wanted Jagir and the actual number of quality Jagir where revenue collection was easy. See, if you see overall Jagir, then that would not be less, because the empire was expanding, so you will have Jagir. But the quality Jagirs where it is easy to collect revenue, and the gap between Jamadami and Hasildami is not much. So if you are being promised 120 rupees in 12 months, you actually get that much, or as close to it as possible. But the gap between the number of Mansabdars and quality Jagirs was getting larger and larger. So even Aurangzeb had to shut down the enrollment of, eventually he had to shut down the enrollment of further Jagirdars. Another problem with him was that he was fighting so many wars, especially in Deccan, that whenever he acquires a new territory, he transfers all the fertile land to Khalisa land, so that that revenue can be used to finance wars. And the bad quality of land is given in Jagirs. So that is also accentuating the problem, that you don't have enough quality Jagirs to give to the Mansabdar class. Even in Mansabdar's class, the problem was more acute with the Khanzadas. I mean, these are the descendants of hereditary nobles, that their fathers, their grandfathers, their uncles had served in the Mughal administration, and they were in a way emotionally attached to the Mughal kingdom, unlike to the groups, say Afghans, that were in a way outsiders, or Rajputs who were in a way outsiders, or Marathas who were in a way outsiders. These people who were emotionally and even ethnically connected to the Mughal Empire, that personally identified with the Mughal Empire, they were suffering the most, because they simply had to wait many years for a Jagir to be allotted, and once a Jagir was taken away from them, they had no idea when they will get the next Jagir. So this insecurity among the Khanzadas, the hereditary nobility, the descendants of the nobles that served under Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, this created insecurity, and this led to factionalism in the Mughal court. Okay. Though I have highlighted this problem very briefly, and somewhere, at least in some places, I have oversimplified it, because otherwise it will go outside the scope of this chapter. You can study these things in detail in optional. Okay. So after institutional crisis, there was this another view, revisionist view. What they said, that look, you keep talking about crisis, you keep talking about the agrarian crisis, so many peasant revolts because of the exploitation of administration and the increase in power of zamindars. You talk about Mansabdari crisis, factionalism in the Mughal court. You talk about any appreciable increase in productivity, a technological decadence, but there were prosperities as well, especially in some regions. They say that the 17th century trade revolution increased regional productivity, not in all the areas, but some areas. However, what happened, that since the Mughal Badshah after Aurangzeb were weak, since nobility was faction ridden, since the military strength of the empire was declining, since there were so many rebellions that the empire could not enforce its edict efficiently, these regional prosperities were not channelized to the imperial center. So empire was not gaining, the regional elites were keeping or appropriating all the profits from that prosperity. This is another view. However, this is not a pan-regional view. They can say this only about certain places like Awadh, Muradabad, Bareilly, or the Pune area or the Bengal. In some other parts of the country, the decline was is certainly fairly visible. Now, this is what they have written in the book. We will see it for here first. Mughal Empire reached its pinnacle as well as started facing a variety of crises toward the end of 17th century due to a number of factors. When they annexed Bijapur and Golconda in the late 17th century in 1680s, okay, that was the pinnacle. They not only annexed Bijapur and Golconda, the Mughal emperor even pushed further south and he tried to conquer areas like Jinji, Vellore, etc. Although he very soon realized the futility of it and he started going back. But immediately after it, there were lots of problems. Even during the reign of Aurangzeb, he had realized that the gap between the actual income of the empire and the required expenditure to run so many wars, okay, to pay for the mansabdars, etc. The gap was huge. Also, technological changes were taking place. Because of it, there was a lot of emphasis on light artillery, field artillery, match the gunners. These things are very expensive. On the other hand, Mughal mansabdars, most of them had cavalry forces. So the war was becoming more and more expensive. You needed more soldiers. So this was also a problem. Eventually, Aurangzeb realized that look, the gap, we have to stop enrolling new mansabdars because we simply don't have good quality Jagirs anymore. So the crisis was already there. Certainly, the seeds of disenchantment among the Khanzadas lay in the reign of Aurangzeb, because even Aurangzeb had to stop enrolling new Mansabdars. Other European travelers are already telling us about the corruption of local Mansabdars and local administration. Because if you have no incentive to increase productivity, to invest in increasing productivity, then you will only exploit. Take away as much as possible before the Jagir is taken away from you. So the corruption was already there. Even the local officials knew that this is a good quality Jagir, Sere Hasil Jagir. So before allotting it to a Mansabdar, let me get some bribery from him. So all this moral decay was causing a lot of problem in the empire. Okay. The lack of good quality Jagir was creating dissatisfaction among the Khanzadas, means the hereditary nobles. Their fathers, their grandfathers, their uncles, their great grand uncles, they had served the Mughal empire, and they closely identified emotionally with the Mughal empire. Unlike the other social groups that had a partnership of convenience with Mughal empire. So it's like saying that your most loyal support base was losing faith in you. And then the factionalism along the ethnic lines started in the Mughal aristocracy. His successors had no option but to continue old harmful Mansabdari practices. See, just as we say that Aurangzeb had, this line was, let me clarify, this line was not there in the book. I have added it here. Though Aurangzeb had, stopped enrolling the Mansabdars, but once he died, there was inevitably a civil war. So, what the new emperor will do? He says that those of you who support me, I will give you high mansab, I will give you high official rank, etc. Therefore, you have to enroll new mansabdars, because the people who supported you, even they will have supporters. So, you have to induct new social groups into mansabdari system. But Aurangzeb knew that this is not feasible, so he had stopped it. So, but you have to continue bad practices. Also, Aurangzeb had turned so much land away from Paibaki land to Khalisa land, which was directly used for royal expenses. They had to take land out of it to pay for, to give as Jagir to the Mansabdars. So they had to do those things because you have no option. You are weak, so you depend due to the emperors after Aurangzeb were so weak that they had to depend on their nobles. So obviously the nobles will extract a lot of concessions from them, right? And in that process they will say, I need high rank. Not only me, even my followers will need high mansabs. Now we will need Jagirs, and for all that you will have to take Jagir out of Khalisa land. So these harmful practices had to be continued by the followers, the emperors after Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb had depleted the financial resources of his empire by fighting a long war in Deccan. For 25 years he was directly there. In fact, the entire reign of Aurangzeb is identified with his preoccupation with Deccan. Aurangzeb was first a governor of Gujarat, then he was a governor of Deccan province of Shah Jahan, and since then he was very closely associated with Deccan. From the very beginning he wanted to annex most of the Deccan. So, and due to technological changes, the wars were becoming more and more expensive. Under his successors, the efficiency of imperial administration broke down. Why? Because see, it's like saying that if your administration depends on IS, IPS, IFS, forest and foreign, and all of them become dissatisfied, and not only them, not only group A officers, the group B, group C, since they are not being paid well, they cannot maintain, if they are not being paid well, then they cannot maintain the required number of soldiers and equipments and weapons. So there is factionalism. So the moral, technological and material decline of administration is a real problem by this time. Okay. It became increasingly difficult for later Mughal emperors to keep a check on their powerful Mansabdars. Nobles and Mansabdars appointed as Subedars, and these are some of the examples of how they undermined the authority of emperor, how they subverted the integrity of Mughal empire. Nobles and Mansabdars appointed as Subedars often controlled the office of provincial Diwan as well. This was a very important tool of check and balance in the Mughal administration, right? They said that the provincial diwan will be directly reporting to the imperial diwan and not to the provincial subedar. So this had separated the power of administration and as well as financial affairs. But what they did, they combined both the offices. They said, no, no, no. I want to combine both the offices. There are so many local troubles that I cannot depend on, I cannot have it, I cannot live with this arrangement that I cannot look into financial matters, I can't control it, I must have those powers. This gave them extraordinary political, economic and military powers over vast regions of Mughal Empire. As the governors consolidated their control over the provinces, the periodic remission of revenue to the capital declined. They made their offices hereditary. This was the ultimate act of, declaring your independence, hoisting the flag of revolt. Because even after all, you are civil servant of your empire, right? Your office cannot be hereditary. If you are a subedar of Awadh and tomorrow you get transfer or orders to go to Kabul, you have to go. Forget. And what used to happen that once a Mansabdar died, all his property escheated to the emperor. Emperor kept a small fee and generously returned rest of the property to his descendant. But that was only the case of personal property. As far as the holding an office, the office of Subedar, office of Diwan, office of Faujdar, whatever might be, the office was separate from the personal property of a Mansabdar. Your office could not be hereditary. But once you started, bequeathing your office to your children, that means now you are sovereign, right? Peasants and Jamindari rebellions in many parts of the northern and western India added to these problems. If you recall, we had talked about Jat, Satnami, Afghan, these revolts. And there were not one revolts, but many frequent localized revolts as well. These revolts were sometimes caused by the pressure of mounting taxes. At other times, they were attempts by powerful chieftains to consolidate their position. So this is essentially we are talking about the agrarian crisis here. See, Abul Fazl gives an estimate that the Zamindar class in India had as many as 4 lakh soldiers with them. This is actually, maybe he's done a statistical exercise here, but by calculating that since there are so many Zamindars on an average a Zamindar maintains these many number of soldiers, so the overall Zamindars in the country would have 4 lakh soldiers, and this is their direct payroll. What about the caste relationship? What we said that if the Zamindars and the peasants of the area belong to the same caste, then they will eventually combine against the exploitation of emperor. See, exploitation is done by both Zamindar as well as empire. But with empire, you don't have caste relationship. You don't know Badshah. He sits far away. So your emotional bond is with Zamindar. So when Zamindar tells you that the emperor is cause of your exploitation, you believe him. And you start, come together. And in fact, caste-based mobilization has been a feature of public life in India. Not only in modern times, even during the freedom movement and going as far back as Mughal period. Mughal authority had been challenged by rebellious groups in the past as well, but these groups were now able to seize the economic resources of the region to consolidate their positions. The Mughal emperors after Aurangzeb were unable to arrest the gradual shifting of political and economic authority into the hands of provincial governors, local chieftains and other groups. In the midst of this crisis, Nadir Shah sacked Delhi in 1739. It was followed by a series of plundering raids by Ahmad Shah Abdali, who invaded North India 5 times between 1748 to 1761. A brief clarification, Nadir Shah was the ruler of Persia. He had removed the Safavid kings. He annexed a large part of Afghanistan and some parts west of Indus as well. But after he died, Ahmad Shah Durrani or Ahmad Shah Abdali emerged as the ruler of Afghanistan. So Nadir Shah was from Persia, but once his empire collapsed, Ahmad Shah Abdali emerged from Afghanistan and he was also conducting plundering raids in India. Already under pressure from all sides, the empire was further weakened by competition among different groups of nobles. the factionalism in the Mughal court, meaning Mansamdari crisis. Because now you were insecure about your income. Why? Because you wanted Jagir, you wanted quality Jagir, but they were not simply enough to go around. That same phrase, ek anar sau bimar. Okay. The reason for the lack of quality Jagir was the agrarian crisis, okay, frequent revolts by zamindars, the overassessment, the problem of overassessment, enrollment of a very large number of new Jagirdars, etc. They were divided into two major groups of factions, Iranis and Turanis. Irani means from Persia and some parts of Central Asia, and Turanis means the nobles of Turkic descents. There were other groups as well. For example, there was this Hindustani group of people, then there was this Rajput groups, but mainly these two were the most important factions. Again, these 2 points I have added here. What it says, some factionalism in a multi-ethnic nobility is okay. It is natural that they will, coalesce into a certain interest group. Even in modern administration, you have, whenever you have a coalition government, you have, certain interest group pulling away from each other. But it reached a critical stage up to the beginning of 18th century, waiting to explode whenever weak Padshah sat on the throne, which was the case after Aurangzeb. So the factionalism was there. It will always be there. Even Akbar had some problems with Uzbeks. They were revolting time and again. Mughals did not have good relations with Afghans because they had, replaced the previous Afghan kingdom. They also had issues with, earlier they had issues with Uzbeks, so they realized that we need to broaden the social base of our nobility. Therefore, they started hiring the Irani group and Rajputs in the administration. So, some amount of factionalism will always be there. But this becomes a problem when the nobility becomes insecure about its prospects. See, you will remain loyal to your master when you know that your master will reward your loyalty. Your hard work will be rewarded. But once you know, even after I work hard for the prosperity of empire, my prosperity is not guaranteed because I am not getting good Jagir. And once they take away a Jagir, I do not know when I will get the next Jagir. So there was this insecurity. And due to this insecurity, there was factionalism in the Mughal court. Okay. And once the weak emperors came after him, I mean, it is surprising that after Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, all of them fought civil wars and all of them were strong enough to control their nobility class. It is only after Aurangzeb that the one after the other weak Badshahs came to the power and their nobles dominated them. And this might have something to do with the habit of Aurangzeb that he intentionally cut down his princes to the size so that none of them would challenge him while he is alive. But maybe he should have considered that what happens when he dies. Because eventually the empire needs a strong-minded Badshah. Alright, he was not the empire was larger than him and it must last longer than him. Maybe this was one of his quirk that later Badshah had to pay for. For a long time, the later Mughal emperors were puppets in the hands of either one or the other of these two powerful groups. Okay, the worst possible humiliation came when two Mughal emperors, Farrukhshir, so soon after him. Farrukhshir ruled from 1713 to 1779. Okay. After Aurangzeb, there was Bahadur Shah first. He ruled for 5 years. Then Jahangir Shah, very brief period of 1.5 years. And then came Farrukhshir. So Farrukhshir and Alamgir too were assassinated. See, he is the third Badshah after Aurangzeb. Merely 6 years after Aurangzeb. And look at the pace of decline of authority of Mughal emperors. And two others, Ahmad Shah and Shah Alam II, were blinded by their nobles. Imagine the level of humiliation. Right? However, the throne stayed within the Timurid dynasty up until 1857. The throne never went to anyone outside Timurid dynasty. Though they lost all respect, they lost all authority. And possibly because they lost all authority, that people thought that they are now benign. In fact, they can be presented as a front and we can control the empire or particular province from behind the scene. I mean, the tactic of when we say that East India Company was an outsider, that is not so. They understood how the politics of 18th century India works. Therefore, Robert Clive got the Shah Alam, this person, Shah Alam II, to write him a Diwani of Bengal, because even then company was saying, look, we are the servant of Mughal emperor, and as a servant of Mughal emperor we are being appointed the Diwan of Bengal. So even they knew that how the politics in 18th century India worked. Same thing was done by many people. None of the successor states, be the Awadh, Hyderabad or Bengal, they renounced the authority of Mughal emperors. Even Marathas, when they wanted to dominate North India, they wanted this boogeyman of Mughal emperor to be the front, right? So it is possible that because after Aurangzeb the Mughal emperors lost all authority, they stopped being a political challenge, that their family continued. If they had been a proper political force, then maybe someone would have replaced them. Emergence of new states. Okay, before that, this part was missed. Giving away, here we said that factionalism was already there, but it came to the fore after Aurangzeb. And how we see that how Mughal, Mansabdars and Mughal officials are showing their power. This is how. Giving away Jagirs from Khalisa land. Since the empire, the state is already becoming poorer. It cannot meet its expenses from the Khalisa land. Yet, they were taking land out of Khalisa land and giving away as Jagirs. Right? Because, each time a new emperor came, he came with the support of very powerful nobles, and he could not say no to them. Right? Some of them were being blinded, some of them were being assassinated. So now whichever faction of nobility has brought you to the power, that will want to be rewarded. Therefore, you have to give them land from Khalisa land. Combining Subedari. This was also new, that they would, especially there was this individual Abdul Samad Khan. He was the Subedar of Lahore, but he controlled Multan as well, and then he bequeathed his Subedari to his son Zakaria Khan. So it is just that there were so many invasions from northeast by Nadir Shah, Ahmad Shah Abdali, and then there were local rebellions by Sikhs, that this part of the empire collapsed. Otherwise, maybe he would have created another state, a local state, just like Awadh, Bengal or Hyderabad. Okay. Absentee Subedar means you want to be Subedar of a province because you want to have income from it, but you can't leave the center because you have to control the politics here. So someone else on your behalf will be Subedar of that province. Viceroy of Deccan. Earlier they would have above Subedar where there was directly Basha. So Basha was for entire empire, and then there was Subedar for a province. But now the emperors were so weak that they had to reward their nobility, and they were so desperately needing those nobility that they created offices like Viceroy, that a noble was appointed as Viceroy of entire Deccan. The Deccan area had around 6 provinces. So you had, you are now the controller in a way, you are the de facto ruler of entire Deccan. So Nizamul Mulk was first appointed as Viceroy of Deccan. So a new office was created, that you control now 6 provinces. Powerful wazirs. The wazirs earlier were not powerful. It was a practice of Mughal emperors to appoint someone of humble origin to the office of wazir, precisely because they should not accumulate too much power. But then now the nobility started, very powerful men started being appointed as wazir. Same family occupying key positions. Say father will be, Asad Khan was prime minister, and then his son Zulfikar Khan was Mir Bakshi. This was also very strange. Kingmakers like Sayyid brothers and revenue farming. So through such practices, the authority of Mughal emperor kept declining more and more, and the power of Western interest group factions kept increasing. Emergence of new states. With the decline in the imperial authority, the Subedars of large provinces and great Zamindars consolidated their rule at local level. In the case of Zamindar, you can have the example of Raja of Banaras. So between Bengal and Awadh province, there was this, small area of Jagirdari of Banaras, and there a local Zamindar entrenched himself. Though it's a very detailed story, not outside the scope of this book right now. Through the 18th century, Mughal Empire gradually fragmented into a number of independent regional states, and they can be broadly classified into three groups. First, old Mughal provinces like Awadh, Bengal, Hyderabad. The founders of these states were former high-ranking Mansabdars. Although extremely powerful and quite independent, the rulers of these states did not break their formal ties with their Mughal emperor. So, theoretically, de jure, they were not sovereign states. They were still the provinces of Mughal Empire. But they paid no heed to the wishes of Mughal emperor. Neither Mughal emperor tried to, impress his authority on them, because he knew the ground reality that even if he wants to, he can't do anything with them. So they will conduct their foreign policy and domestic affairs entirely independently, making wars with each other, concluding peace, offering territory, winning territory, all such things. They were totally independent. Even on their coins, they would still have the impression of Mughal emperor. The khutbah would be read in the name of Mughal emperor. All the trappings of sovereignty still lay with Mughal emperor except the income. Money is not reaching to him. And if he doesn't have money, he cannot be powerful enough to, reimpose his authority. States that had enjoyed considerable independence under the Mughals as Watan Jagirs, primarily Rajput states. These included several Rajput principalities, and obviously once the center becomes weak, they were obviously allied. These were alliances of convenience. So once center becomes weak, why they should remain, why should they pay their obeisance to the emperor? They also became independent. The last group included states under the control of Marathas, Sikhs and Jats. They practically fought for their independence. Okay, and they had no need to continue with the trappings of Mughal sovereignty. They were independent. They loudly proclaimed so. They were never in alliance with Mughals. So there was no problem of like, okay, earlier we were Watan Jagirs, but now we are not. So they are totally independent, and they had practically fought their independence from Mughal Empire. First come Hyderabad, Nizamul Mulk Asaf Jah. Now from here, see, since we have already seen the broad trends, these are now only stories from this point on. Okay. Nizamul Mulk Asaf Jah, the founder of Hyderabad state, he ruled from 1724 to 48. This is not his lifespan, this is the period for which he was the ruler of, the de facto independent ruler of Hyderabad state. Was one of the most powerful members at the court of Mughal Emperor Farrukhsiyar, the one who got assassinated. But even before Farrukhsiyar, he had enjoyed a very high mansab during the reign of Aurangzeb. In fact, he had the mansab rank of 7,000, a very high rank. Okay. As the Mughal governor of Deccan province during 1720-22, Asaf Jah had already gained control over its political and financial administration. What happened that there were these called Sayyid brothers, called kingmakers. Okay, they got rid of Farrukhsiyar. They put then two more emperors on the throne of Mughal Empire, but they died quickly because of the excessive consumption. Then they put on Muhammad Shah in 1790. But he realized that I have to get rid of these two brothers because they will control me, they will not let me function independently, and they will always be a constant threat to my life. So he gathered around some nobles. Among them was Nizamul Mulk and Asad Khan, the governor of Awadh. They got rid of Sayyid brothers. So for that they were rewarded with the, Asad Khan was rewarded with the Subedari of Awadh, and Nizamul Mulk was rewarded with the Subedari of Deccan. See, the entire Deccan, there were total 6 provinces in Deccan, right? During 1722, he had gained control of its political and financial administration. He was then recalled as Wazir to the center, where he was dismayed by his inability to implement his reforms due to the competition among the court nobility. Means, though he was a product of Mughal factionalism, he could not overcome that factionalism. He wanted to reform the land revenue system. And the details of which should be studied in optional classes. Right now, it is outside the scope of this book. So he tried to reform central administration, but he could not. So, taking subsequent advantage of the turmoil in Deccan, he carved out his own kingdom. And there is this funny story how he, see, once he helped Muhammad Shah to remove Sayyid brothers. Therefore, Muhammad Shah rewarded him with the viceroy. He made the Subedar of the entire Deccan, the viceroy of entire Deccan. But then he was recalled as Wazir because they needed someone capable. But there he could not implement his reforms. So he said, "Fine, why not? I will carve out my own dominion." This is the thing with ambitious people. If they cannot, satisfy their ambition within a structure, within a company or within a corporation, within an empire, they will eventually move out and start something their own. So this was his own startup. But the grounds on which he is left was rather funny. He said that I am going to my local Jagir, it was very close to Delhi, to get some fresh air. I am bothered by the crowd and chaos of Delhi. I am going to my Jagir. He left Delhi on that pretext and then gradually moved to Deccan. He said, okay, I am never coming back. I will set up my own startup there. Okay. Asaf Jah brought skilled soldiers and administrators from northern India who welcomed the new opportunities in south. He appointed Mansabdars and granted Jagirs. Basically what it is saying, that full sovereignty. Although he was still a servant of Mughal emperor, he ruled quite independently without seeking any direction and without facing any interference. Mughal emperors merely confirmed the decisions already taken by Nizamul Mulk. Gradually, Hyderabad developed its own brand of administration. What it meant is that you have to have a delicate balance between the vested landed aristocracy as well as the administration of the government. The Hyderabad was constantly engaged in a struggle against Marathas and independent Telugu chiefs of Plateau. See, the problem with is that we saw that he was the viceroy of entire Deccan, and Marathas wanted to expand in the Deccan. They were very close to each other. So eventually he lost out during 1720s. They had fought few battles, but he eventually lost out to the Marathas and he was reduced to the state of Hyderabad, right? Because so the ambitions of Nizam to control the rich textile producing, and then apart from Marathas, he had issues with the independent Telugu warrior chiefs, the landed aristocracy we talked about. So just as the Mughals had to incorporate the local people into their Mansabdari system, similarly even these new states will have to accommodate the local landed aristocracy into their administration. The ambitions of the Nizam to control rich textile producing areas of Coromandel coast were checked by the British, who were becoming increasingly powerful in the region. So powerful that immediately after his death, succession struggle for the Hyderabad state was a factor behind Second Carnatic War, right? Though the Carnatic Wars, they are mostly studied when you study the modern India, okay? Mainly fought between French and the British. French will back the one side, all three Carnatic Wars. The British will back the other, okay? And when he died, there was the succession struggle for the Hyderabad state, and eventually it fell into the hand of British. In trying to consolidate their rule, this question is asked though I have to clarify here, though it was a subject of Carnatic War, that means the interference of European companies started very soon into the affairs of Hyderabad state. The Hyderabad state did not extinguish by hook or crook, continuously losing its territory. It continued right up till the independence of India, the time at which there was a military action against Hyderabad state to incorporate it into the Indian dominion. So though the interference of British started very soon and they kept milking this cow, but it was not extinguished like so many other provinces. Now they have asked this question in NCERT, that in trying to consolidate their rule, why did Mughal Subedars also want to control the office of Diwan? Well, the answer is simple. To consolidate their rule at the local level, you have to consolidate your control over the local finances. Only then you can, set up your own army. Only then you can employ your loyal people in key positions, so that whenever the imperial farman comes, nobody is listening to their farman. We all are listening to your orders. So this rather commonsensical answer. Then Awadh. Burhanul Mulk Sadat Khan ya Saad Khan was appointed Subedar of Awadh in 1722. See, same period. Here, when he was in this period, he was very close to when Nizamul Mulk was appointed the Subedar of Deccan. He founded a state which was one of the most important to emerge out of the breakup of Mughal Empire. He, along with Nizam, had taken part in eliminating the Sayyid brothers at the behest of Muhammad Shah. This part was not given in the book. To clarify the point, we have added it, that why he would be rewarded with the Subedari of Awadh. So, once he helped the Muhammad Shah, an emperor, to eliminate these, two brothers who were controlling him, rather, suffocating him. So he was rewarded with the Subedari of Awadh. And see how well he repays that, loyalty. He also held a very high mansabdar under Aurangzeb, a very high mansab under Aurangzeb. See, just as Nizamul Mulk, he also had held a very high mansab, almost 7,000 rank. And he was the wazir, and his son Zulfikar Khan was Mir Bakshi. This was very strange thing, appointing father and son as your prime minister and military minister. Okay, and Aurangzeb was so impressed by them that he left his will, in which he says that whoever becomes an emperor after me should listen to Asad Khan. So this is the one of the mistakes of Aurangzeb, appointing such family members to such high positions. Awadh was a prosperous region controlling the rich alluvial Ganga plain and the main trade route between North India and Bengal. Burhanul Mulk was also held the combined offices of Subadari, Diwani and Fajdari. Means he also combined the military and financial powers. But why was he allowed? Though Deccan is very far, but why was he allowed to combine all these offices? The reason is that there were so many agrarian revolts led by local zamindars, and since imperial center is not able to help you regularly, so he says that, look, let me handle this issue locally, but give me more power. Okay, let me control the local finances so that I will have more soldiers at my disposal, so that I can dispatch them quickly wherever there is a revolt. So a local crisis was utilized by a local ambitious ruler to consolidate his power on his province. Sadat Khan declared his de facto independence when he refused to be transferred to Malwa in 1926, and eventually he was succeeded by his son-in-law Safdar Jung. So he made the office of Subedar, which was just office, not kingship. He made that hereditary, that after me my son-in-law will become, and after him his relation will become. And when you refuse to be transferred, that is, and Mughal authority, the imperial center, is not taking any action against you, that literally means that you are now independent. Same thing was done by the Subedar of Lahore. He was told to go to Kabul, but he did not go. He kept his control over Multan and eventually combined the Subedari of both the provinces, and then he was succeeded by his son. So this was a common way of declaring your independence. Sadat Khan tried to decrease Mughal influence in the Awadh by reducing the number of centrally appointed Jagirdar, because obviously if a Jagirdar is centrally appointed and he is able to extract resources from your province, so he will be loyal to center, not to you. He also reduced the size of Jagirs so that larger Jagirdars are not there, and appointed his own loyals to vacant positions. The accounts and the same practice was adopted by Nizam as well as the Bengal, that you stop this appointment of Jagirdars from center and appoint your own people. The accounts of Jagirdars were checked to prevent cheating, and the revenues of all districts were reassessed by officials appointed by Nawab's court. Okay, he seized a number of Rajput jamindaris and agriculturally fertile lands of Awadh of Rohilkhand. They were also a bunch of adventurers that had set up their own kingdom in the early 18th century. Their leader was Bangash Pathan. In Rohilkhand, they had set up their kingdom, but since they were abutting the province of Awadh, so they were always in conflict. And even with the help of British East India Company, Nawab of Awadh took lands of Rohilkhand. State dependent on local bankers and Mahajans for loans. This is a very key feature of all the later states. We will discuss it later. It sold the right to collect tax to highest bidders. See, earlier they had proper system. They had Japti system where revenue will be assessed, okay, and on the basis of Dastur, you will be charged that okay, you have to pay certain revenue, and it will be collected by bureaucracy, and then it will be handed over to Jagirdar. But they got rid of all that. They said, okay, we will simply auction the right to collect revenue. These revenue farmers or ijaradars agreed to pay a fixed sum of money, and they would pay in advance most of the time. Local bankers guaranteed the payment of this contracted amount to the state. In return, the revenue farmers were given considerable freedom in assessment and collection of taxes. And since they were very much free, so it is possible that at least in some areas they exploited a lot, at least in some areas. These developments allowed new social groups like money lenders and bankers to influence the management of the state's revenue system, something which had not occurred in the past. So much so that some of the bankers were given contracts to mint the coin. The royal mints were handed over to them, so that you see how much coins should be minted, and you mint them. You control their quality, you control their design, and you issue mints. Okay, they would allot mint to even other groups. So such was the control. They practically became the new kind of if you say, there is this modern term called state capture, that certain interest group or business group control the decision making of state. So you can imagine this level of relationship between these new social groups like bankers and the provincial kings, provincial officials. Something which had not occurred in the past. Some of the historians call them portfolio capitalists. The penetration of European companies into the hinterland certainly added to prosperity and created new interest groups. Okay, so they say there is this body of opinion that says that since the British, French and Dutch companies, they were trading very much not only along the ports but in the countryside as well, and it can be confirmed with the records of export import. So they were creating new business opportunities in the hinterland, in the countryside, and due to these increased trading activity, the urbanization, money economy, all those things that we read in the ancient history, those things got increased, accelerated. Therefore, these new mercantile groups became more powerful, and then due to the unique revenue administration of provincial states, they became attached with the provincial administration. Bengal gradually broke away from Mughal control under Murshid Quli Khan, who was appointed as the Nayab Subedar. He wasn't even full-time Subedar, the Nayab, deputy of Subedar. He was effectively in charge of the Bengal since 1703, when Aurangzeb had sent him to Bengal to shore up revenue collection, which he did admirably. Aurangzeb needed resources in 1703, the peak of his Maratha campaign, anti-Maratha campaign, so he needed resources. And he knew that the Bengal province at that point was under-assessed, so he sent a capable officer to reassess the income of the province, which he did quite admirably, increase the revenue of the province. Although never a formal Subedar, he quickly seized all the powers that went with the office. So despite he wasn't appointed a Subedar, he became a de facto Subedar. Like the rulers of Hyderabad and Awadh, he also commanded the revenue administration of the state. In an effort to reduce Mughal influence in Bengal, he transferred all the Mughal Jagirdars out to Odisha and ordered a major reassessment of revenue of Bengal. Revenue was collected in cash with great strictness from all zamindars. As a result, many zamindars had to borrow money from bankers and moneylenders. See here also the influence of the corporate, not corporate but portfolio capitalists increased. Those unable to pay were forced to sell their lands. The formation of a regional state in 18th century Bengal therefore led to considerable change among the zamindars. His son-in-law Sujat Khan succeeded him. So again your relation succeeds you to a provincial office, means you are de facto independent. The close connection between the state and bankers, noticeable in Hyderabad and Awadh as well, was evident in Bengal under the rule of Alivardi Khan. During his reign, the banking house of Jagat Seth became extremely powerful, so much so that they played a role in the usurpation of throne. Bengal used to send regular tributes to imperial. This point we have added these points. Bengal used to send regular tributes to imperial center until 1740s, when regular Maratha raids snapped the last semblance of allegiance to the central authority. What happened that unlike the provinces of Awadh and Hyderabad, Bengal kept sending regular tributes. But at least Murshid Quli Khan kept sending regular tributes. But once in 1740s, in 1739 there was attack of Nadir Shah. So the credibility of Mughal emperor went to the rock bottom. Then from 1740s, Marathas started expanding into Bengal and into Punjab, etc. So they were conducting regular attacks on Bengal. So to defend from those attacks, what Alivardi Khan did, he ceded the territory of Orissa to them, and he also had to spend a lot of money on defenses. So they stopped paying tributes to the Mughal emperor at this point. Bengal Nawabs had regular tiffs with the British EIC over the use of dastak, which was issued by Farrukhsiyar, where he said that company can conduct duty-free trade across the empire for import-export purposes only. That Farrukhsiyar, earlier it was given in 17th century, it was given by Aurangzeb for Bengal province only. Later Farrukhsiyar turned into an all India permit, all India duty-free export-import trade. All India, rather all empire you should say. But on the issue of especially the misuse of dastak, Bengal Nawabs had regular problems with British EIC, and push came to shove during the reign of Sirajuddaula, leading to Battle of Plassey. And then we know the famous story which we will see in modern India. We can detect three common features among these states. First, though many of the larger states were established by erstwhile Mughal nobles, they were highly suspicious of some of the administrative systems that they had inherited, particularly the Jagirdari Mansabdari system, because they know that the factionalism in the Mughal court, that was the biggest cause for the decline in authority of Mughal emperor, was directly a result of Jagirdari problem. So they knew that no, I would not replicate it in my state. I will have entire nobility fully dedicated to me. So they were already dissatisfied with the Mansabdari system, therefore they did not like it. Their method of tax collection differed. Rather than relying upon the officers of the state, all three regimes contacted with revenue farmers. The practice of Ijardari, thoroughly disapproved by the Mughals, spread all over India in 18th century. Their impact on the countryside differed considerably. See, earlier there was this historical bias, because Mughal empire or the Mughal Bashas did not like this system. So it was believed that it must be more exploitative than the systems like Jabti, etc. But now that opinion has slightly shifted, that they say that maybe Jabti was also very exploitative, and this might have differences in the regional impact. Okay. All these regional states had emerging relationship with the rich bankers and merchants, aka that is also known as, it is not a word, it is a short form of also known as portfolio capitalist. What they did, that they invested in all kind of businesses. They not only controlled the the provincial finances, but they invested in all kinds of businesses. They invested in land, they invested in trade, they invested in import, export. Therefore, they had built a large portfolio. Therefore, they would be called portfolio capitalists. These people lent money to revenue farmers, received land as security, and collected taxes from these lands through their own agents. Throughout India, the richest merchants and bankers were gaining a stake in the new political order. For example, Bengal. In Bengal, they gained so much stake that once Sirajuddaula became a problem for them, they conspired with the East India Company to remove him. So, such was the sudden increase in their power, and it was unthinkable during the time of Mughal Emperor. The historiographical debate about the relationship of these states with the economic growth. See, certainly in the case of Bengal, there was provincial prosperity, no doubt about it. Because if you recall, we talked about the 17th century trade revolution. Then, if you look into the commercial records of the European companies, you will see that they were exporting so much from Bengal, and in return, they were not giving goods; they were giving precious metal. So, in case of some province, the economic prosperity is definitely it took place. But in some other places, say Punjab, where there was a lot of local unrest and repeated foreign invasions, that might not be so. Okay. Then in the case of Muradabad, Bareilly, Awadh, these areas, the growth of regional towns, bazaars, the growth of regional trade and such indirect evidences, they also point out that maybe even here there was prosperity. But in and around Delhi area, maybe not so much. So there is a rich historiographical debate about the changes, especially the economic impact of 18th century political changes. Okay. Though these things, they are a subject matter for optional classes. The Watan Jagirs of the Rajputs. This was the second category. Many Rajput kings, particularly those belonging to Amber and Jodhpur. Amber, you can compare it with modern Jaipur. Okay, just for simplification, this area had served under the Mughals with distinction. Actually, not only they, but the Rajput families of Bundi, Kota, Jaisalmer, Bikaner. Okay, these were also serving. They had also served under the Mughals, but these two were very prominent, and the members of these families had enjoyed very high rank in the Mughal Mansabdari system. In exchange, they enjoyed considerable autonomy in their Watan Jagir. They were de facto rulers of the de facto sovereign of their Watans. Okay, all they had to do was to surrender one or two key forts that was important to maintain overall military control over the region. Except that they had full political, religious, economic, independence within their area. So this was in a way, token. So once you enroll in the Mansabdari system, your own state will be given as Watan Jagir, and if they are giving you some additional responsibility, if they are making you a Faujdar of some other province, or appointing you on some military campaigns to far off region, or if they are making you Subedar, for example, Mansingh was Subedar of Bengal for a period, so they will give you additional Jagir. Now, before we go further, let me repeat, the importance of Aurangzeb's flawed Rajput policy has been overemphasized. It has been proven that yes, Aurangzeb's Rajput policy was hasty, miscalculated, and it backfired. And because of this, the Rajputs stopped being the strong point of Mughal emperor, but certainly they were not a major cause of decline. It's just like during the time of Akbar, when they were very good allies and they were a force to reckon with. They were, I would say, a pillar of Mughal state. But up to the Aurangzeb's time, that stopped happening. So, but even if they were not a strong pillar of support, they were not that big a cause of decline. Okay, the importance of Aurangzeb's miscalculation in the case of his Rajput policy have been overemphasized. Okay, however, once the empire became weaker, okay, they had no incentive to keep supporting the Mughal empire. Just as other Mughal officials, they also started looking after their own interest. Okay. In the 18th century, these rulers now attempted to extend their control over adjacent regions. So even they wanted to expand now. They wanted to annex the weaker Rajput states. See, the difference between Aurangzeb's Rajput policy and Akbar's Rajput policy is that the Akbar's Rajput policy ensured that the Rajputs were very good, useful allies. They helped to expand Mughal Empire. Okay, what Aurangzeb did, he certainly broke the trust, and because of that, they were not that productive ally, but they were not the a very important cause of decline as well. There were other causes of decline due to which even Rajputs eventually withdrew their support. Ajit Singh, the ruler of Jodhpur, was also involved in the factional politics at the Mughal court. The influential Rajput families claimed the subedari of rich provinces of Gujarat and Malwa. See, just as other other Mughal nobility, that they thought that, okay, if we cannot survive at the Mughal center, let's create a regional control, a regional dominion. Therefore, similarly, even they are saying that, look, give us the subedari of states like provinces like Gujarat and Malwa. Raja Ajit Singh of Jodhpur held the governorship of Gujarat, and Savai Raja Jai Singh of Amber was governor of Malwa. But very soon the governorship was taken away because of charges of corruption or charges or conspiracy against him. These offices were renewed by Emperor Jahandar Shah in 1713. But they did not hold the subedari of these provinces, Gujarat and Malwa, for very long. Because eventually when Marathas started pushing forward, they became a problem for Rajput states. They also tried to extend their territories by sieging portions of imperial territories neighboring their watans. See, even they wanted to control now imperial territories neighboring their watan Jagir. Because, see, simple thing, once an alliance has to be useful for both sides. If it has stopped being useful to Rajput states, they have no reason to remain loyal, isn't it? Even at the time, even when Aurangzeb interfered in the succession struggle of Marwar state, and due to which there was this whole blow up. First, the Marwar state was the Jodhpur states, okay. First, Mewar supported it, and there was a blow up. But even at that time, many of the states like Bundi, Kota, Bikaner, Jaisalmer, the Kachwas of Amber, they were still allied to and loyal to the emperor. However, eventually this problem died down, and the relationship, normalcy, more or less returned. Okay, but even then, normalcy did not mean that they were, they were helping or bolstering the Mughal Empire. They were just, okay, normalcy, a détente has happened, but they were not bolstering the Mughal Empire at that point. And eventually, once the empire started becoming weak, therefore there was no benefit in remaining allied to the empire. So they started even chipping away at the imperial territory. Nagaur was conquered and annexed to the house of Jodhpur, while Amber seized large portions of Bundi. Savai Raja Jai Singh founded his new capital at Jaipur and was given the subedari of Agra in 1722. A description of Raja Jai Singh in a Persian account in 1732 tells us about his power. Okay. See, earlier Jai Singh was given the subedari of Malwa. Here we had said that was given the subedari of Malwa, but then he was given the subedari of Agra. Why? Because gradually the Marathas are pushing up, and they were controlling more and more territory. Raja Jai Singh was at the height of his power. He was governor of Agra for 12 years and the Malwa for 5 to 6 years. He possessed a large army, artillery, and great wealth. His sway extended from Delhi to the banks of Narmada. And he is the one who has set up around 6 Jantar Mantars in Delhi, Banaras, Mathura, Vrindavan, Ujjain, and Jaipur. In these 6 places, he set up these astronomical observatories. And he was really a man of art as well as science, because the city Jaipur he set up, it was planned, perhaps the first planned city after Harappan period. So he was also a very interesting personality of 18th century. Maratha campaigns into Rajasthan from 1740s put severe pressure on these principalities. Basically, two houses, the Sindhyas of Gwalior and the Holkars of Indore area, they were creating pressure on them. Put pressure on these principalities and check their further expansion. Marathas had a bitter relationship with the Rajput states, which eventually came under the paramountcy of British, and when the paramountcy lapsed at the time of independence of India, then they were gradually incorporated into the modern Rajasthan state. And then we will talk about three states that seized their independence. That means they fought for it. See, if you recall the chapter on Bhakti movement, then we had talked about that the Nanak's message of active life, simple religion, justice and equality, it had both social as well as political implications, right? Due to this, a unique cultural identity developed. Okay, that means a unique identity, a regional identity develops. If you recall, we talked about that once a regional identity develops, then gradually political ambitions will also rise. Also, the emphasis on justice and equality meant that they will not accept the subjugation or the exploitation of imperial authority very kindly, isn't it? So, this certainly had a political implication. The organization of Sikhs into a political community during the 17th century helped in regional state building in Punjab. Several battles were fought by Guru Gobind Singh against the Rajputs and Mughals, both before and after the institution of Khalsa in 1699. There in the chapter on Bhakti, what we had talked about, that once the community of Sikhs started becoming rather autonomous, a state within the state, so the Mughal provincial authorities started getting nervous about it. Guru Arjan Dev had issues with Jahangir. What happened that he was accused of blessing a rebel prince, so on that ground he was executed. Then there were occasional skirmishes and blow-ups between provincial authorities and the Sikh community. Eventually Guru Tegh Bahadur was executed in Delhi. So this was gradually the conflict between Mughal authorities and Sikhs started increasing, and Khalsa Panth was set up in 1699 by Guru Gobind Singh. He had fought against these Rajputs are the hill Rajputs, the hill areas of the current Punjab and Jammu, not the Rajputs of Rajputana, but the Rajput states of the hill areas of Jammu and Punjab. Okay. After his death, means death of Guru Gobind Singh in 1708, he died in Nanded. He was on his way to meet Aurangzeb, but both died very close to each other in 1707 and 1708. Khalsa rose in revolt after his death in 1708. Khalsa rose in revolt against Mughal authority under Banda Bahadur's leadership. He was the what Guru Gobind Singh had done. He had said that after me, the book Guru Granth Sahib is the Guru. Okay, so Banda Bahadur wasn't 11th Guru. No, the Guru Gobind Singh had clarified that after me, follow the book. He was in a way, Banda Bahadur was in a way a political leader in a way. Okay, a political leader of Sikh community. The religious authority is completely with the book now. Declared sovereign by striking coins in the name of Guru Nanak and Guru Gobind Singh, and set up an administration between Satluj and Yamuna. Okay. See, one thing I will recommend, that whenever you are reading history, please keep your atlas near to you. That helps us to to understand, to get a geographical sense of the political events. After a concerted campaign, Banda Bahadur was captured in 1715 and executed in 1716 during the reign of Farrukhsiyar. Okay, that means even at this point the relationship were very hostile. Mughal authority eroded considerably in Punjab due to Mansabdari crisis, invasions and perpetual disturbance in countryside. See, the Sikh movement up to this point had become a popular movement. Therefore, it will be very difficult to control the countryside. Every now and then there will be some flare up here and there. Also, if you recall, we had talked about that there was this individual noble Abdul Samad Khan. He was supposed to be the Subedar of Lahore, but he started controlling Multan as well. Okay, and then eventually merged these two provinces and made it, after him, his son Zakaria Khan became the regional official. So just as Awadh, Hyderabad and Bengal was breaking away, so was this area. Then there were invasions by Nadir Shah and then by Ahmad Shah Abdali very frequently. So what happened that the authority in these areas completely collapsed, and then you had a popular movement. Sikhs organized themselves into a number of jathas and later on missals. After the last invasion of Ahmad Shah Abdali, when the Mughal authority had completely crumbled in the area, Sikhs set up separate missals. These missals were in a way a confederation of these small groups, and they were ruling their areas independently. Their combined forces were known as the Grand Army, Dal Khalsa. The entire body used to meet at Amritsar at the time of Baisakhi and Diwali to take collective decisions known as resolutions of the Guru Mattas. So in a way, you can see you can get a sense of a very strong confederacy here, that different missals are coming, though they are ruling their areas independently in the greater Punjab area, but they are occasionally coming together to make collective decisions, and you get a very strong sense of confederacy. Just as in tribal societies you have separate areas of influence, but every now and then they will come together to take collective decisions. A system called Rakhi was introduced, offering protection to cultivators on the payment of a 20% tax, a tax of 20% of the produce. This is de facto sovereignty. Once you start collecting taxes from an area on whatever be the ground, you can say that this is a protection money, you can say that this is the fee to the sovereign, whatever you call. But if you can effectively collect taxes from an area, that means you are sovereign on that area. Guru Gobind Singh had given a rallying cry that their destiny was to rule, Raj Karega Khalsa. So this a constant inspirational signal that we are supposed to be our own rulers. No imperial authority should control us. So this was a sense of solidarity, a sense of ambition. Their well-knit organization enabled them to put up a successful resistance first against the Mughal governors and then against Ahmad Shah Abdali through his repeated raids. Abdali had seized the province of Punjab and Sarkar of Sirhind from Mughals, but his control did not last long because the Khalsa organization, first beat away the Afghan authorities, and then Khalsa declared their sovereign rule by striking their coin again in 1765. Okay, so very soon they threw away the Afghan control. The Sikh territory in the late 18th century extended from the Indus to Jamuna. In late 18th century, from Indus to Jamuna, which is even today, this would be roughly the area of Greater Punjab. But they were divided into different rulers, different missals actually. Out of these missals, one missal was Sukar Chakia missal, Maharaja Ranjit Singh from Sukar Chakia missal, and he reunited these areas into a Punjabi state with his capital at Lahore in 1799, and he started expanding from Peshawar to Jammu to these areas. Okay, he even attacked as far as Sindh. So the dream of a united state realized rather late, because in between there was so much chaos. There was a decline of provincial authority, repeated foreign invasions and such things. Then there were missals for a few decades that controlled their own areas, and then eventually by 1799 a Punjabi state came up. But by that time you can say it was already late, because through Battle of Plassey, Carnatic Wars, few Mysore Wars and Maratha Wars, English company had emerged as the de facto the power of India, that they were bound to eventually rule the whole subcontinent. Then the Marathas. The Maratha kingdom rose out of a sustained opposition to Mughal rule. Shivaji carved out a stable kingdom with the support of powerful warrior chiefs, Deshmukhs. So these are the, you can compare them with the zamindars of North India. Okay. Look, the story of the rise of Shivaji, and before him his father, because his father had served under the Bijapur Sultanate. It's a rather detailed story, and the gradual rise of his family, these things are outside the scope of this book, but just take it from here that Maratha kingdom rose out of a sustained opposition to Mughal rule. Shivaji carved out a stable kingdom. Then there was this Treaty of Purandar. If recall, there was this movie recently in which they talked about that how Savai Raja Jai Singh came to here and he had defeated Shivaji, and then he conducted a treaty called Treaty of Purandar. In Treaty of Purandar, he surrendered lot of forts. The strategic position of Shivaji became considerably weak, and he eventually went to Agra to hold negotiations with Aurangzeb. However, just as many other occasions in Aurangzeb's life, he blew away a very good opportunity. Okay, and even Shivaji was imprisoned, he escaped, and there are many glorious stories about his escape. And then eventually he again started the struggle for the Maratha Swarajya. So the treaty of, and this is where the difference starts. Akbar on the other one hand understood the impulse of Rajput movement, so he allied with them and made them a force that helped in the rise of Mughal Empire. Aurangzeb on the other hand, he fought Marathas head on. Okay, and the reason is, first his control over Deccan collapsed, called the Deccan ulcer for Aurangzeb, and then eventually the Mughal Empire also collapsed. After Shivaji's death, so once he came back from Agra, he crowned himself Shivaji, and then after a while in 1680 he died. After his death, effective power in the Maratha state was wielded by a family of Chitpavan Brahmins who served Shivaji's successors as Peshwa. Pune became the capital of Maratha kingdom. See what happened after Shivaji's death. His son Shambhuji, after Shivaji's death, his son Shambhuji became Chhatrapati, but he was captured and soon executed by Aurangzeb. This was also a mistake, that if you have captured such popular leader who is a source of inspiration for an entire community, you appropriate him, maybe incorporate him into Mansabdari system, whatever, but you have to appropriate him. You don't think that, okay, I am cutting off the head of the snake and the snake will die. No, you are giving inspiration to a proud community that will rise up and make your life hell. Then after his death, so he had a brother Rajaram. Okay, he fled to Jinji, which is in modern day Karnataka, and from there he kept ruling. The son of Shambhaji, Shahuji, he was captured by Aurangzeb, taken to Agra, and he remained in the captivity of Mughals till Aurangzeb died. Bahadur Shah, who was the Bahadur Shah the first, who came after Aurangzeb, immediately released him, sent him back, and this started the Maratha civil war. Because when Rajaram died, his wife started ruling in the name of her minor son Shivaji II. So there was this civil war between the followers of Shahuji, and they are both son of Shivaji. They were both sons of Shivaji. Shambhuji was captured and executed by Aurangzeb, and he imprisoned his son. After Shambhuji, his brother Rajaram was ruling from Jinji court, which is in Tamil Nadu. And when Jinji is here. Okay. So once what happened, that he had captured Golconda, he had captured Bijapur. So then he invested these areas, Aurangzeb. Even Jinji fell, but by the time Jinji fell to the Mughal authority, Rajaram had come back here to Satara. Okay, here he died, and on behalf of his minor son Shivaji II, his wife was ruling as regent. And when Shahuji was released after the death of Aurangzeb, he came back, and there was this civil war between the followers of Shahuji and followers of this minor Shivaji II. And basically his mother Tarabai was the main magnet around which the Deshmukh class was, organizing. And in this situation of confusion, Balaji Vishwanath, the Chitpavan Brahmin Peshwa that we talked about here, comes into picture. He rallied important Deshmukhs around the cause of Shahuji. Okay, he helped him conduct, cut deals with Mughals so that his authority became gradually, his authority gradually increased. So at this point, the Peshwa comes into picture. Another disclaimer: the office of Peshwa wasn't a Maratha invention. The office of Peshwa already existed under the Deccan Sultanate, under the Bahmani Empire, Bahmani Kingdom, and under the successor Deccan Sultanates. Okay, Peshwa means in a way a prime minister. Highly mobile peasant pastoralist Kunbi. Kunbi is a community from Maharashtra highland, provided the backbone of Maratha army. Under the Peshwas, the Marathas developed a very successful military organization under the Peshwas, because from Balaji Vishwanath onwards, his son Baji Rao, then his son Baji Rao, the effective authority was with the Peshwas. Their success lay in bypassing the fortified areas, raiding, basically in guerrilla warfare. They became, really master of guerrilla warfare. If you recall, then we had talked about the Malik Ambar who had fought on behalf of Ahmednagar Sultanate. And he is the classical tactician that introduced the element of guerrilla warfare in Deccan. Engaging armies in areas where supply lines and reinforcements could be easily disturbed. Marathas ensured that they did not have to face Mughal artillery, because even when the Mughal Empire was crumbling, facing Mughal artillery was a major challenge. See, this is the Maratha Swarajya area. Okay, and between 1708 to 1720, the focus of Peshwa Balaji Vishwanath, who rallied the important Deshmukhs around the cause of Shahuji, his focus was A, gain full sovereignty over the Maratha Swarajya area, the area that over which Shivaji had set up the kingdom, and gain the right to collect Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi from the 6 Deccan provinces. Okay, there were 6 provinces, 6 subas in the Mughal dominions in the Deccan. So A, gain full sovereignty over this part, and B, collect Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi from the 6 Deccan provinces. We will see what Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi are. And on this issue, they had repeated wars and conflicts with the Nizam of Hyderabad. Because see, he also wanted to control the same area, they also wanted to collect taxes from the same area, so the conflict was inevitable. Then, however, see what had happened, that in 1719, Peshwa Balaji Vishwanath had conducted a treaty with one of the Sayyid brothers that were controlling the Mughal emperor at the time, and he gave them right to collect Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi from the 6 Deccan provinces. Okay, so after this point, they started expanding outside of Deccan. But before that, let's say what is Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi that we talk here. Chauth is, as the word suggests, 25% of the land revenue collected from an area, and Sardesh Mukhi is 10% surcharge on top of that. Okay, though both the traditions of collecting Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi have predated the Marathas in the area, but by collecting Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi from an area, they effectively asserted their suzerainty over that area. Okay, and when in 1719, when Peshwa got the right to collect Chauth and Sardeshmukhi from 6 Deccan provinces, he knew that he cannot collect tax from such a large area with the help of a centralized army and administration, which was anyway small at the time. So he set up Maratha Sardars in different parts of the Deccan and surrounding areas. Their job was to collect Chauth and Sardeshmukhi from the area under their control, and out of Chauth 33%, matlab first 25% of land revenue is Chauth, and out of this 33% went to Peshwa, and entire Sardeshmukhi, which was the 10% of land revenue, so 33% of Chauth and the entire Sardeshmukhi went to the Peshwa. And since he set up Maratha Sardars so early in the life of Maratha Empire, that this problem, became a centrifugal force in the Maratha Empire, and the Maratha Empire eventually turned into a Maratha Confederacy, where powerful Sardars were controlling their spheres of influences. So, to highlight, from 1708 to 1720, the focus of Balaji Vishwanath was to establish full sovereignty over Swarajya area and collect Chauth and Sardeshmukhi from the 6 Deccan provinces, which he got in 1719. And to collect Chauth and Sardeshmukhi from such a large area, he set up Maratha Sardars over different areas, so that they will collect tax and they will pay some portion to the Chhatrapati. 25% of Chauth, 33% of Chauth, because Chauth is already the fourth, okay, and the full Sardeshmukhi amount. Rest they could keep with themselves. And this practice of appointing Maratha Sardars over different areas, this continued even when the Maratha Empire expanded. So Maratha Empire eventually turned into a confederacy of powerful Maratha Sardars. From 1720 to 61, the Maratha Empire expanded. It gradually chipped away at the Mughal Empire. Malwa and Gujarat were seized from the Mughals by 1720. See, if you recall, these were given as Subedari to Rajput chiefs, but they were taken away by Marathas. By the 1730s, the Chhatrapati was recognized as the overlord of entire Deccan Peninsula. What happened that during 1720s to during this period, they had to fight a few wars with Nizam, because Nizam wasn't willing to accept this arrangement that you can keep the Chauth and Sardeshmukhi from the entire Deccan, because that would undermine his authority. So they had to fight a few wars with Nizam, and eventually Nizam also accepted their sovereignty over this area, and he was reduced to the Hyderabad state. After raiding Delhi in 1737, the frontiers of Maratha dominion expanded rapidly into Rajasthan and Punjab in the north, okay, into Bengal and Orissa in east, and into Karnataka and Tamil and Telugu countries in the south. These were not formally included in the Maratha Empire, but were made to pay tribute as a way of accepting Maratha sovereignty. What sort of tribute? Again, Chauth and Sardeshmukhi. Expansion brought, let me re-emphasize again, Chauth means 25% of land revenue and Sardeshmukhi means 10% of land revenue. Out of this 25%, 33% went to Chhatrapati and the rest went to the Maratha Sardar that was collecting revenue on the ground, and the entire amount of Sardeshmukhi went to Chhatrapati. Expansion brought enormous resources, but it came at a price. These military campaigns also made other rulers hostile towards the Marathas. As a result, they were not inclined to support the Marathas during the third battle of Panipat. See, when you study history as optionals, you will read about several instances where there were a lot of bitterness between different states and Marathas. Okay. Bitterness with Rajputs, bitterness with other northern Indian states. Therefore, they could not gather allies for the third battle of Panipat. So recently there was this movie which it really played with history. It was completely a historical movie. And please, though you are free to watch movies it's a good form of entertainment, but do not form your opinion of history on the basis of movies. Movies are made to earn money, not to teach history. So for to that end, they will glorify individuals and they will demonize individuals without understanding the nuances of history. Okay, and this is nothing new. Kalidas wrote a play, Malvika Agnimitra, on the basis, and in this book, this play was based on a prince, Agnimitra, of Shunga dynasty in the post-modern period. So now, how much he knew about the prince, the actual life of that prince? It's his purpose was to produce something creative. Similarly, the movie makers, their purpose is to create something, create a form of entertainment. Historical accuracy is not their concern. It never was and it will never be. Therefore, whenever you are watching movies or stuff like that, okay, get your entertainment, your dose of entertainment, but do not take it as a medium to understand history. Okay. The reason behind Marathas fighting Third Battle of Panipat alone was entirely strategic. It had much less to do with religion or other considerations. Okay. It's a very delicate exercise to build your alliances. Okay. It requires sagacity and foresightedness to build alliances. If you don't, if you make some strategic mistakes, then you won't have allies. The Marathas developed an effective administrative system as well. Once conquest had been completed, Marathas' rule was secure. Revenue demands were gradually introduced, taking local conditions into account. Agriculture was encouraged and trade revived. This allowed Maratha Sardars like Scindia of Gwalior, Gaekwad of Baroda, Bhosle of Nagpur, and there was Holkar of Indore. I don't know why they have not given Indore here. The resource of these allowed the Maratha Sardars to raise powerful armies. Maratha campaigns into Malwa in 1720s did not challenge the growth and prosperity of cities in the region. Ujjain expanded under Scindia's patronage. Okay, here they have given Holkar. Holkar was also a Maratha Sardar. Okay. By all accounts, these cities functioned as important commercial and cultural centers. These Maratha Sardars emerged out of the original arrangement to collect Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi, because Peshwas knew that it is not feasible to collect Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi from such a vast region solely on the basis of the centralized army. Therefore, they set up individual ambitious Maratha Sardars over certain areas. They were a bit like Iqtadars, a bit like them. They were tasked to collect Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi, they keep their share and send the rest to the Chhatrapati, and gradually these Maratha Sardars took it upon themselves to expand the territory of Maratha Empire. For example, from Nagpur area, Bhosles of Nagpur, they expanded into Odisha and Bengal. In 1740s, they repeatedly attacked the Bengal province. Therefore, the Bengal Nawab had to cede the territory of Odisha. Similarly, the Scindia interfered with the issues with Ganga Yamuna Doab. In 1722, he brought 1772, he brought the Mughal Basha from Allahabad to Delhi, and from then onwards he was under the patronage of Scindia. And here also they have given Gaekwad of Baroda. Okay, Scindia as well as Holkar, they were constantly pushing into Rajputana, and since they were rather uncharitable, or say rather they were not generous enough to build alliances in this area. Therefore, there was bitterness as well. New trade routes emerged within the areas controlled by Marathas. The silk produced in the Chanderi region now found a new outlet in Pune, Maratha capital. Burhanpur, this is at the border of Maharashtra and MP right now, which had earlier participated in the trade between Agra and Surat, now expanded its hinterland to include Pune and Nagpur in the south and Lucknow and Allahabad in the east. See, if you pick up the atlas, you will realize that how earlier its main trade was between the port of Surat and the imperial city of Agra. But now, not only it traded between the complete north and south, it was also trading with east as well as Pune in south and Nagpur in the east. So its trade network expanded. However, since because due to the unique nature of Maratha administration, the individual Sardars became very powerful, especially the four: Sindhya, Bhosle, Gaikwad and Holkar. So a Maratha empire developed into a Maratha confederacy. The control of Chhatrapati and control of Peshwa was limited to the Swarajya area. The rest of the empire was controlled by different Sardars and they were pretty much independent. Okay, they had their own administration, they had their own court. So it was originally a Maratha confederacy. Then eventually Third Battle of Panipat, it kind of put a break into the expansion of Maratha Empire. Though Maratha Empire recovered quickly after it and again became the preeminent power of North India, but it ensured, it made us realize that Marathas would not eventually become the sovereign of India. That task was to be completed by the European company. And after the death of Sahu in 1750, the effective power of Maratha confederacy shifted from Chhatrapati to Peshwa. Okay. Now Chhatrapati was only a figurehead, just as the President of India. The real power went into the hand of Peshwa once the Chhatrapati Sahu had died. And then the Jats. See, the Jat rebellion is linked to the agrarian crisis. Okay, the Jats had revolted frequently. In fact, see, the peasant revolts were not unique to 18th century or 17th century. They were taking place since the time of Akbar. But earlier they were localized, they were small and they were easy to subjugate. But in the second half of 17th century, they became large. A very large number of villages led by local zamindars would suddenly revolt, and it became difficult for local Mughal authorities to suppress them. And it became very common for local Faujdars to die in those localized wars. Jat uprising in Mathura region in 1667 under the leadership of local zamindar Gokala was put down after heavy losses. This is the first example. But the situation again flared up, and by the 1680s, they had begun dominating the region between two imperial cities of Delhi and Agra. See, if you read the segment on Jats in the chapter, they have not written in this order. They have basically given some information, because eventually you are supposed to teach a 7th standard kid. So you will write only as much as they can grasp. But if you are studying for competitive examination, there is a rationale and logic to writing, sentences or giving argument one after the other. Therefore, we have slightly changed the manner of presentation here. For a while, they became the virtual custodians of the city of Agra. It was led by Raja Ram and then his successor Churaman Jat. Okay, they put up a stiff resistance but had to surrender in 1691. See, in this second case, what had happened? The issue was the conflict between the primary zamindars see, they are just above the peasant at the local level, and then intermediary zamindars. Now they are connected with the peasant society by caste ties. So Jat peasantry, Jat local zamindar, they would collect the revenue from their peasantry, and they would have some of their own land. They will collect tax, they will pay tax from there also, and these were appointed by imperial administration, the intermediary zamindars. You can compare them with jagirdars. Okay, in a way you can call them jagirdars. So the conflict was between these two groups at this point, between intermediary zamindars and primary zamindars, because they were the representative of Mughal empire at the ground level. So their job was only collecting revenue. They were outsider to the region. They had no real interest in the society or agriculture of the region, whereas primary zamindars, they shared the caste ties with peasants. They were locals. They had interest in the agriculture of the region, and they felt exploited by the intermediary Zamindar, who was the man on the ground of Mughal Empire. So when the second time the Jats rebelled, Aurangzeb appointed Kachwaha ruler Raja Bishan Singh. Okay, he gave him the Mathura area as Jagirdari and made him the local Faujdar. He said, go suppress the rebellion. This is your Jagir. If you can collect revenue, that is your profit. So it was kind of a good trick that you give someone incentive to establish law and order in the area, because if there is no law and order in the area, he cannot collect income from his Jagir. So there was this conflict between primary and intermediary Zamindar. Later on, Churaman Jat exploited the incessant civil wars and weakness of Mughal authority in 18th century. So in 1691 they surrendered, but eventually in 18th century they set up their independent Jat principality and ousted the Rajput intermediary Zamindars from the area. They acquired control over territories situated to the west of Delhi. Jats were prosperous agriculturists, and towns like Panipat, Ballabgarh became important trading centers in the areas dominated by them. See, they were very close, such an independent kingdom so close to the Delhi. Now imagine the decline of royal imperial authority. There is this place called Maidan Garhi in Delhi. That was the closest outpost of this Jat state to the imperial center. Under Surajmal, kingdom of Bharatpur emerged as the strong state. Bharatpur, which is currently in Rajasthan, it was the capital of this Jat state. The power of the Jats reached its zenith under the Surajmal, who consolidated the Jat state of Bharatpur during 1756-63. The areas under the political control of Surajmal broadly included parts of modern eastern Rajasthan, southern Haryana, western UP and Delhi. Surajmal built a number of forts and palaces, and the famous Lohagarh fort in Bharatpur is regarded as one of the strongest forts. When Nadir Shah sacked Delhi in 1739, many of the cities notable took refuge in Bharatpur. Now imagine the reversal in the political influence in the area. While Bharatpur fort was built in a fairly traditional style, at Dig, Jats built an elaborate garden palace combining styles seen at Amber and Agra. So now they are fusing the architectural element of different regions. Its buildings were modeled on architectural forms first associated with royalty under Shah Jahan. The palace complex at Dig has Bangla Dome on Assembly Hall. So obviously the Bangla Dome was adopted at Agra, Fatehpur Sikri, and eventually even they took inspiration from it. Now there are some other important topics or events that happened in this period, the period which this book covers. Okay, the book covers this period. For example, the rise of Mysore state, the Carnatic Wars, there were 3 of them, and the rise of European companies, especially British and French East India Company. However, the reason they have skipped these events, these important political events, because they are more closely associated with the history of modern India. So once you start studying modern India, the class 8 NCERT, you will hear about these events there. So with this, the last chapter of 7th class history NCERT ends. Okay, thank you very much.